And in here, what we've been doing is studying the canons of Scripture. And the reason we're doing this is just kind of set the stage, because some people might say, well, you're trying to add to the canon. No, we're not. So we want to define a canon. We want to follow different things like that. So what we have over the past 3 weeks, we've looked at these, and we basically looked at the study, and you can click on these if you're a member of the site and look at them. But the Old Testament, what we basically said was that the Old Testament was put together by prophets. So the concept that Moses did things to prove he was a prophet, and he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Joshua wrote Joshua, and we see things that going on in the book of Joshua, like the sun standing still, a whole bunch of things like that. So basically, whether the person writing the book or not was a prophet, and I think probably almost all of them were, the prophets put them together, and that's the concept we want to say. And so when we're studying the Old Testament, we found that the Ezra Apocalypse mentions that the canon was closed by Ezra under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to what they consider to be 24 books. And that's confusing to some, but we were just saying how we group them differently. They have one book of the 12 minor prophets. We have 12 separate books of each one of the prophets. So we divide them differently. But we've got these 39 books of the Old Testament, and that's where it was sealed. That doesn't mean that there can't be a prophetic writing, 100% accurate history, accurate theology, history of theologians, a history of heretics, and that wouldn't be important for some of us to know, but it's not to be added to the canon. So that's the really important part. And we saw in that study that that's basically how the King James 1611 was put together. The compromise was between Anglicans and Protestants and Catholics. The Catholics wanted the Apocrypha in the Old Testament, and that's the way it was written in the Septuagint, or some of the Septuagints. Septuagint itself is an interesting study, which we didn't get to for that because we're just trying to figure out books in the canon. But basically, the compromise was to take what the Roman Catholics wanted in the Bible that was outside the Old Testament canon and put them in the center in between the Old and the New Testaments, because you wouldn't want to add those to the New Testament either. And in so doing, the compromise was the Roman Catholic Apocrypha put in the center, but also the Anglican Apocrypha, so that Ezra Apocalypse was added, which explains why it should be divided that way, and other interesting prophecies in it. So that's how we got to that. Then we looked at the New Testament, and the same kind of an idea that the prophets put that together. You start with the teachings of the disciples of the Messiah himself. So you start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you go on up. We talked about how Paul was actually prophesied in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so obviously a prophet in that sense. And of course, the book ends with John writing a vision that he saw from God, dictated basically by Jesus Christ. So we end with a prophetic book. And so at that point, the canon is closed. And we speculated that, maybe in the kingdom age, those two witnesses maybe, or someone else might write books to say, this is how actually it took place. So maybe there'll be other things too. But in either case, it wouldn't be added to the New Testament or added to the Old Testament. So the concept of different canons is what we want to look at. So then we looked at the Apocrypha, and we saw that same thing. We looked at the books of the Apocrypha. And then last week, we kind of looked at that, and we looked at the Orthodox editions. Let's just look at that real quick. They have the Apocrypha here, the Ezra Apocalypse, and then some basic notes for it. And we said that these, the current versions we have, do have errors in them, but that doesn't mean a whole lot. So for instance, Judith, we said, was a record of an incident that happened when the Assyrians were attacking the 10 tribes, but it happens to mention that Nebuchadnezzar was leading it. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is a king of the Babylonians, and that was like 100 some odd years later. So again, somebody just added some word or mixed up the leaders or something. So we've got all these things too. So pretty interesting. Some of the interesting points. Now, I'm Protestant, I'm actually Calvary Chapel. So I would stick with just the 39 books of the Old Testament as the canon. But some of the interesting things about it, some of the Protestants will just totally throw away anything extra biblical. And one of the arguments was, well, it doesn't appear in Hebrew anywhere. And that is a very, very good argument. If it was real, it would have been written by Jews in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. So why would we have the Greek and not the Hebrew? Very good question. But some of these things, it's interesting. For instance, we mentioned that the entire book of Tobit, which is an apocryphal work, is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's 4Q 196 to 200. So what does that mean? It means they were aware of it. It means apparently there really was a Hebrew version. So it's something that we might want to look at again for historical notes. So we've got this kind of thing going on, much like Josephus. No one would put Josephus in the canon. Actually, somebody did, but you really shouldn't. So we looked at that and pieces of Sirach and other things like that. So last week we finished by looking at the Orthodox editions. And what we were saying is that even though that's the way it's supposed to be, some religious groups put extra books into their Bible canon. And that doesn't mean anything other than the fact that I'm kind of glad they did because they preserved them that way. So they're not scripture, they're not part of the 39 books, but they're there anyway. And so what we did is we looked at the Anglican Church and then found out that there's the Greek Orthodox, there's many Orthodox churches, but these 9 specifically we looked at. So the Greek, the Syrian, the Georgian, the Assyrian, the Slavic churches, the Egyptian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and then the Ethiopian Orthodox. And then if they had any extra books in their canon that are also mentioned by the Dead Sea Scrolls, the church fathers, or something like that, we would put those in there. So then we said basically all the Orthodox canons have the 39 books of the Old Testament. They're not missing anything. They have the 27 books of the New Testament. They're not missing anything. They have the 13 books of the Roman Catholic Apocrypha with the Ezra Apocalypse. So we looked at these. These are the first and most important. And anything in red we can click on, and there's either another article on it, or in this case, we would be able to go get our translation, the Bible Facts translation of it. So this is one of the, I consider, really important prophetical books that are that's outside the canon. So anyway, the interesting part is that the Anglican and the Slavic churches have the entire book. For some reason, the Assyrian, the Georgian, Syrian, and I guess those churches also have it, but thought that chapters 1 and 2 and 15 and 16 were later additions, so they don't have them in their canon. Interesting debate on those type of things. But then we just looked at some of these others. So the Ethiopian canon, along with the Ante-Nicene Fathers and the Dead Sea Scrolls, either have pieces or quote pieces of the Book of Enoch. And we went through some of these others. So like the Syrian and Armenian churches have 3 Corinthians. And I don't have that linked, but we have 3 Corinthians available too, translated. Anyway, we have all of these others. Now, some of these, especially when you get down to some of the things that are in the Ethiopian canon, the Ethiopian canon is the largest. It has some 80 books in its Old Testament. And several of those have never been translated into English. So I don't know if they're worth looking at or not. Eventually, someday, someone will translate it. It's an interesting language. It's not even Amharic, which is their current language, but it's a really ancient form of it called Ge'ez. And most of you know, like, for instance, the Hebrew language currently has 22 consonants and vowel points. English is 20, 25, 26 letters. We used to have a couple of more. But the Ge'ez language, I think, has over 200 letters. So it's a really interesting language. Basically, what they're doing sounds. So there's a B, like a ba, a bay, a boo, a bo, that kind of stuff. So that's how they come up with some 200 and some letters. So anyway, so some of these are definitely not what they're supposed to be. We mentioned like the history of Joseph and Asenath. Gary Stearman was talking about that the other day. And so really interesting history of Joseph and his wife. This one here, Josephus' War from Book 7, is in the Ethiopian canon. It's specifically that part about how the things that happened at the temple right before it was destroyed. So really interesting prophetic miracles and things like that. And then we mentioned Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans is in some of the Wycliffe and Quaker Bibles. And I think I mentioned to you last week, but in addition to some of those over here, there is a Waldensian Bible called the Vaudeau. And the history behind it is that it was a translation from people who knew the apostles back in the 2nd century BC, or AD rather. And what's interesting about it is that it has the Old Testament, the 39 books, the New Testament, the 27 books. It has no Apocrypha in it. But the one thing it does have is the Laodiceans. So it'd be really interesting to do this. I've never seen one. I don't know if any still exist. But there is a lengthy discussion about it between John Wesley and I think it was Jonathan Edwards. So it's kind of interesting things. So Psalm 151, we all have 150 Psalms in our Bible. And Psalm 151 is in almost all of these, including Dead Sea Scrolls, Nicene Fathers, all of those quoted. So, and then the 12 patriarchs, we made an interesting comment about that the story is kind of the same. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, somebody says that they found Hebrew copies of these things in some caves in Judea somewhere, brought it to the Armenian church. The Armenian church recognized it as being legitimate, translates it into Greek, and puts it in their canon. Well, that's the story, but nobody knows where the original Hebrew copies went. You know, the church using Greek would simply say, don't know, don't care. We have the official, so it's not an important thing. But that's just one of those things that just sounds too convenient. So it's something that you kind of dismiss. But then when we come back to the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, people discover a whole lot of Hebrew scrolls in those Judean hills. And pieces or some fragments of them were parts of the 12 patriarchs. When we get to it, the Dead Sea Scroll study, we're going to look at those in depth. We'll have the other lists up to talk about them too. So it's just really interesting that that was in the Armenian Bible, Dead Sea Scrolls, and of course, Nicene Fathers. So that's where we kind of left off last week. And so this week, I just put this up today. So we're going into extra biblical books, not books in the canon, but books that the canon itself would recommend. So that's our study for today. And we're going to look at some of these. Let me just pull this up here. So this is basically just a list. And so it'll be there for us to look at. And if I've doubled them or I'm missing one or something like that, just let me know. But we'll just go through some of these. So from the Old Testament, there is a legend about 5 prophets that are called the Lost Five. It's a really interesting legend. We've talked about this in our introduction to Gad and other things like that. But in 1 Corinthians 29:29, it mentions that there is Gad the seer, and we see him all the way through Chronicles in Samuel. He was one of the seers of David. And then Nathan was one of the seers of David and Solomon. And so there are these prophets that actually do things. But in 1 Chronicles 29:29, it mentions the fact that he wrote a book, a prophetical book. And then it also mentions that Nathan wrote a prophetical book. And then it mentions in 2 Chronicles 9 that there's a prophecy book or a book of prophecies and probably history written by Ahijah the Shilonite, his other Ahijahs rather. And then there's in 2 Corinthians 12, there's Shemiah, and then there's also the prophet Iddo mentioned in 2 Chronicles 13, 12, and 9. So these are the prophets in the time period of Samuel. And so they talk about these in the books of Samuel and Chronicles about Samuel the prophet, his writings. So I'm assuming then we're just talking about what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel, is the writings of Samuel the prophet. And if that's a model, you can see how it's mainly history, but there are some very important prophecies kind of scattered around in there. Anyway, so that's the legend that these guys wrote. Well, we know from scripture they did write books of prophecy. And I remember in different people in seminary saying, well, these guys probably took all of their notes and put them together, and that's how we got Kings and Chronicles. And I'm sure that's true. Somebody wrote Kings and Chronicles, and according to the legends, and it would be the prophets who put them together or overseed them or whatever. So, but the way this is talking about is that there's specific books, which may or may not be all included in the canon. So, come to find out, long story short, there is a group of Jews that believed the prophecies about the Assyrians coming down and taking the 10 tribes captive. This would be around 720 BC. So if you've seen prophecies and you know there are real prophecies in the Bible, and you're living in a country that's going to be decimated in the next 5 or 10 years, and you already see the prophesied person beginning to move this direction, if you're intelligent, you just pick up and move. I mean, God's got nothing against you. You're a worshiper of the Lord, and He's warned you: repent or be annihilated. Your brothers here don't repent, so we pick up and move. And you can follow their wanderings basically through the histories. But they have not even a complete Old Testament like we do, not even the 39 books, because they never knew anything about the some of the minor prophets and some of the others. But they do have Gad, Nathan, Ahijah, Shemaiah, and Iddo. And we're trying to get our hands on those. And officially, we keep being told, no, those don't exist. We don't know what you're talking about. And then I was finally told, no, you cannot have them. So that tells me that there's something there. But 100 to 150 years ago, there was a Jewish guy, again, long story short, that actually translated the book of Gad the Seer into, I believe, Dutch. And since then, we have found a couple of more Hebrew copies, Hebrew fragments going along with it. And it is another amazing prophetical book. We have a few pieces of Nathan, which are very, very interesting too. Have some very, very interesting prophecies in it. One of the things is interesting. A lot of Jews, for instance, today will look at when we talk about the virgin birth, and we quote Isaiah chapter 7. Behold, a virgin will conceive, bear a son, and will call him Emmanuel. A lot of them will say, well, it's the word Alma. It's not the word Bethula. So Alma actually could mean young person. Like they're a virgin, but they're like, they haven't grown up yet. So, that kind of stuff. So this is a young girl that gets married. She was a virgin, that kind of thing. So there's this argument on whether there's really a virgin birth or not. And a lot of people have argued, well, Bethula is a young bride. Alma is a virgin. And people would say, no, it's the other way around. So it's an interesting debate among some of the Jews. But the book of Nathan the prophet is really interesting because it prophesies a virgin birth, but it doesn't use Alma or Bethula, no specific word for a virgin. The prophecy basically says that there is going to be a young woman who has never been with a man. However, she holds in her hand her baby boy, and her baby boy is the Lord of the earth to the ends of the earth. So that's an interesting prophecy. So there's a virgin that is never conceived the normal way, but she has her baby boy in her arms. That's a virgin birth. Didn't use Alma, didn't use Bethula, didn't use anything else. It's descriptive. So you can't really argue the language. And so the fact that he's the Lord of the earth to the ends of the earth would have to mean he's either Adam, Lord of the earth, but Adam lost control, or he's Noah, who is the Lord, the king of the entire planet, but he lost control. This person doesn't lose control. And so this person we understand is the Messiah. So the girl is the mother of the Messiah, which apparently is an actual virgin the way we think of it. So anyway, it's just interesting how some of these things, it's the exact same prophecies, And we don't know. Isaiah may have been thinking about this or even quoting him in that sense. But in either way, these kind of things are really interesting if they come out to help with this. When we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls study, we're going to see a lot of little things like that where they don't quote. We quibble about the words, and they will not even use those words, either one. They will describe it to the point that we know what they're talking about. So anyway, I don't have much of anything, just a few hints of what's supposed to be in Ahijah, Shemaiah, and Iddo. So very little that I know about them. But it's an interesting thing. So the biblically endorsed books, we're just looking at what the Old Testament, at this point, the Old Testament, says about books. So in Chronicles, we have the book of Gad, the book of Nathan, the book of Ahijah, the book of Shemaiah, and the book of Iddo. So those are books that are mentioned, but again, not supposed to be in the canon. The books of Samuel are supposed to be in the canon. So pretty interesting. So those are the lost five specifically. And then we also have other prophetic type books. So in 1 Kings 4, it mentions the Proverbs of Solomon, the fact that there's 3,000 of them. And I don't know if that's close to 3,000, exactly 3,000, or if they mean there's over 3,000. However you say that, that's more than the amount of Proverbs we have in Proverbs. So there's some extra ones out there. The Songs of Solomon, they're supposed to be 1,005. And so it's interesting to me, there's actually a Dead Sea Scroll that counts up the number of proverbs and songs that Solomon had, the number of psalms and songs that David wrote, and they are more than what we have in our biblical books of Psalms and Proverbs. I'm sure some of these are in our canon, and obviously some of them are not because there's way too many. But we have a record then from Kings and Chronicles. So if you can see what we're doing, we're not adding to the canon at all. It's supposed to be exactly what it is. But if it says more than this exists, or at least used to exist, if we can find it, we need to look at it. Understanding they could be corrupted, they could be mistranslated. Got to be careful of anything extra biblical. But we need to continue the concepts. In 2 Chronicles 33:19, we have something called the sayings of the seers. And it's interesting to me, the word there is Hosai, and it's plural, but basically it can mean seers, or it could theoretically be a person's name. So in some translations, you'll see this as the book of Hosai. And it could be that way, but it's probably the book of the seers. And again, some people have said, well, that's all the prophets. And so the prophets simply wrote First and Second Kings, First Chronicles, First, Second, these things. And that's possible. It's always possible. But the way that it's worded in Second Chronicles 33:19 is that there's a specific words of the sayings of the seers. And so a lot of times you might have a person who is a prophet overseeing like the development of the canon and putting together historical notes here, chronology notes of who's, the king's nephew and who would be possibly the next king, and doing all that stuff. You also might have over here a book of prophecy. And you might mix some of them together if the prophecies end up talking about a certain person or whatever. So anyway, and then we have the vision of Isaiah mentioned in 2 Chronicles 32:32. My guess is we're talking about the prophecy of Isaiah. So it's just Isaiah. Not necessarily, though. There could have been something else. The basic teaching in the scrolls is that anything that was put in the canon is in there because it has something to do with end time prophecy. So if Isaiah, for instance, wrote a prophecy that some guy's a bad guy, and if he doesn't repent, he's going to get struck by lightning, and he got struck by lightning, and that's all there was. It has nothing to do with end time prophecy. The concept in the scrolls is that that would have never been put in the canon. So there could be something like that somewhere else. And that kind of makes sense because in the New Testament, where we're told about the daughters of Philip were prophetesses, Agabus was a prophet. There's one or two prophecies he made about Paul. Don't know if he wrote a book or not, but those kind of things. And there was Quintinus, the church fathers talked about. And that goes back to the argument of, do the gifts cease? And I don't believe they did, because the Pharisees back in the days of Jesus said the gifts stopped. Well, they did for them, because these guys are heretical. They're not even teaching real Jewish theology. The Essenes, of course, were noted to be 100% accurate prophets and healers. And then, of course, if you're a Christian, you believe the New Testament. So there's all sorts of prophets, miracles, and things in the New Testament. So obviously it continued. And then the question is, did they stop with Christians? Well, again, there are cults and there are just lukewarm churches that probably nothing happens in. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that make stuff up also, but I don't think that they stop. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of church fathers that say that the gifts do not stop until, as Paul said, that which is perfect has come. And then to define that which is perfect as being the rapture of the church, or the second coming, the end of the church age. So it's interesting to see that that was their concept. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. They're not apostles, but if they were back there and knew the disciples of the apostles, it's kind of puts them up a little higher on the commentary scale. So again, and here's an interesting one. In 1 Kings 4:33, it talks about Solomon's botany or biology book, and he's talking about the benefits of like bees and animals and plants and things like that. So it's either some sort of food preparation and or medicine. And basically, in the Eastern way of looking at it, food is medicine. If you eat the proper food, you won't need medicine. If you need medicine, then you know you're not eating the proper food. They would talk about things like that. And so we know about Hagi, which is the herbal medicine book, and we will get to studying that here pretty quick. Um, so we'll actually have a section in here where we can study herbal medicine and look at things from a Dead Sea Scroll perspective. So what did they recommend we eat or not eat or cook or fasting or, whatever they said? Because according to Josephus and the others, these guys were 100% accurate prophets. They were also people that lived to be about 110 to 120. And that was because of their diet. Not that they ate kosher or didn't eat kosher, because the Pharisees ate kosher, or supposedly. Sadducees, who knows? They didn't really believe in anything. But so the kosher food probably made you live a little longer than the Gentile food, because the Gentile food was pretty messed up. Some Gentile food back in the day. But in addition to food, though, there's maybe their genetics were better too, but we're exploring that kind of thing. We're actually beginning to figure a few things out. Some of us has begin doing experiments with herbs and things that fit the description. We don't know if it's the same one or not, but are having really good success with some of this stuff. And, so, and again, we're not saying anything about any type of controversy that's been amongst the Christians and doctors in the last couple of years, if you know what I mean. But the whole concept is, if there's ever any kind of a problem, be it them or even you can't get to a doctor. You can't buy whatever because something, somehow you just can't get it where you're at. We need to know at least the basis of like first aid. You need to have a first aid kit in your home just in case, that kind of thing. You need to have a fire extinguisher in your home just in case. I love the fire department. They do a much better job than I do. But if it's going to take them time to get here, I need a fire extinguisher and I need to know how to use it. And so that kind of stuff. And some of the prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we will eventually get to talk about the fact that, especially in the end times, you need to be somewhat self-sufficient. And they talk about how you need to have a minister in your church that knows the word well, that teaches morality, teaches everything properly. You need to have a prophecy expert, and that may or may not be, your main minister, but at least somebody that you can go to that is not even necessarily a prophet, but a son of the prophets, a student, a serious student of Bible prophecy. And then they also mention you must have a Hagi expert, an herbal medicine person. And that begins to be more and more important as the day approaches. So really interesting. And if you think about it, it makes sense, especially if you were in the tribulation period for whatever reason, and then you got saved and you've got to somehow make it through to the second coming. And whether you get shot or beheaded or not, but something could happen, poisons, you're out trying to hunt for food, accidents happen. You probably need to know how to take care of yourself. So, not that I'm a prepper or anything, but it's interesting. So, we're trying to figure all that out from their perspective. So, the fact that a biology book or a botany book is mentioned is kind of interesting. So, going on in the Old Testament, just unknown. We're not sure what these things are. There's the Book of the Wars of the Lord. There has been a small section of the book called the Book of Wars, may or may not be this one, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's not much to it, but there's enough that we need to study it. There's the Book of the Covenant and the Book of the Lord. The Book of the Covenant could simply be like Deuteronomy, or it could simply be like the covenant structure of the Essenes, if they were the original one. So we have like the book we just recently released last year, a fresh English translation of the Damascus document and the community rule. It's that kind of stuff put together. I'm not sure what this is, but it's mentioned. And then law books. We have the Law of Kings. We have a midrash on the Book of Kings, and then a treatise on the Book of Kings mentioned in those places. So we translated what we think is the Law of Kings based on what Samuel said in 1 Samuel 10:25. And basically what that is that, and this helps our understanding. Because I have Hebrew roots friends, for instance, that say we're supposed to do the entire law of Moses. Well, that's fine. Make sure you compartmentalize it. You're not a king, right? So you don't go execute somebody without a trial. The king could do that. You're not a king, okay? You don't sit in judgment and hold somebody in your basement locked up until you decide what to do with them, because you're not part of the Sanhedrin, okay? You're not a woman, so you don't give the offering for giving birth, because you don't give birth if you're a man. And so there's these things like that. You're not a priest, right? So you don't do the things associated with sacrificing animals or running the temple rituals. That would be forbidden. So you've got to compartmentalize these, okay? And the book of the Law of Kings is specific, the law that kings of Israel are to do, and their understanding of Gentile law and Hebrew law and how it works together. It's an interesting study. And then historical, this is the Old Testament, probably just history. So, for instance, we have the Acts of Solomon, the Acts of the Kings of Israel. I've got that in there again, so this one needs to be taken out. But we don't know if the Acts of Solomon and the Acts of the Kings of Israel are kings, or maybe chronicles, or maybe pieces of it that were put in later, maybe more detail. Maybe we already have all that. We don't know for sure. There's the Acts of Uzziah, the Amalekite Memorial Book, the Annals of Jehu, the Book of Chronicles mentioned by Nehemiah. That very well could be First and Second Chronicles. Then there's the Book of Jasher mentioned in Joshua, and again, we've got a link here to it. We have a translation of that. We don't know for sure if everything in it is accurate, if something has been embellished. You never know about that kind of stuff, but it does help explain a lot of things. A lot of the stories in it that seem fantastic are also found in the Talmud and many other places. So, since this is supposed to be older, it makes you think this could be legitimate. There's several fake books of Jasher floating around, much like we looked at before. There's the book of Enoch. There's several fake books of Enoch floating around. And it's nice to have the church fathers in this area, because they'll tell you what we consider first Enoch is the book of Enoch, and second and third and all these other things were written by cults later. And so that's pretty interesting, just to have the church fathers tell you that. Sometimes they'll actually tell you, we know this is fake because we know which cult wrote it. We know the guys behind it. We've excommunicated them, or they're in prison or whatever now. and it was somebody's brother, and it was over here, and they'll give the whole history sometimes on some of these things. So pretty interesting. That's why we need to pull it all together. The scrolls tell us the theology and what's supposed to happen. The New Testament tells us exactly how it did happen. And then the church fathers continue the story and say, because of everything that happened, this is what we do. And these are legitimate and these are not. So it's really nice to see that kind of thing. And when I say church fathers, I mean ancient church fathers. So just the like first and second century people that would have been eyewitnesses of the apostles, or at least their parents were eyewitnesses of the apostles way back there in the beginning. So then we have the Book of Laments, Book of the Kings of Judah. That could be kings, Judah and Israel. The Book of Samuel the Seer. I'm sure that's First and Second Samuel, or one of them at least. There's the Chronicles of Jehu, this might be a different Jehu because it's a son of Hanai. There's the Chronicles of King David, the Chronicles of the Kings, Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. They may be the same. Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, Chronicles of David, and the Chronicles of Samuel. So again, we don't know too much about these. The only one in here that we're fairly sure is not part of the canon is the Book of Jasher. And then finally, that ends our 40 some in here. But from the New Testament, we have a handful. And so we wanted to look at these. First, in Jude 9, it gives you the story about Moses dying, and the Michael wants to preserve the body. Lucifer wants to take the body for whatever reason. And the writer in Jude is saying, well, this is a perfect example of humility. You know that Lucifer doesn't deserve or need to take what he's trying to take. The body of Moses does not belong to him. But just because you know that this is an error doesn't mean that you're the one supposed to stop in and stop the whole process. Probably, but not necessarily. And so it's a good model of not bringing against yourself a railing accusation. Now, if the Lord had told Michael, for instance, you guard this and make sure nobody touches it. If somebody tries to touch it, shish kebab them. You do whatever it takes, but you protect this. Then Michael would be held accountable and would have done something with Lucifer. So it's all in that situation. We need to understand that too. We know what's right and wrong, like in our society, but unless the Lord tells you to run for office, to start a militia, to do something like that, it may not be part of the Lord's will. You always got to try to figure out the Lord's will. But in this concept that Jude is trying to teach about morality and the understanding of that stuff, he mentions that story. And that story, according to the early church fathers, is in a book called The Ascension of Moses. We have parts of that today, but we don't have the ending part. So the story about what Jude is quoting, we don't have. So I don't know really anything else about it. And then in Jude 14, and also in the book of Jubilees, but it talks about the book of Enoch. And these are quotes by names. I'm not talking about if they loosely quote them, but a quote by a name. So first Enoch is mentioned by name. And I think it's Enoch 1:17 or 19 or something like that. The entire verse is actually quoted by Jude. And interesting thing about this, and again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, the whole concept is that even though Enoch might be the original one and it might be a good one, the original was translated probably multiple times throughout the centuries, then translated into Ge'ez, and then translated into English. And Jubilees and Enoch both, when you compare the fragments of Enoch and Jubilees we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the stories are the same, but the numbers are different. And I've mentioned that before, but the book of Jubilees, for instance, it starts off with creation, and at one point it just keeps getting off and off and off. So the date for a certain event is up to 300 years off. But then all of a sudden it changes and it starts going back the other way. And so from creation to I think it's the death of Jacob, it's within 1 year of Genesis. So no matter what chronology you use, the fact that it gets way off 300 years and then comes back to being pretty much there, somebody's tampered with the text, or on purpose or accidentally, but it's garbled somehow. And we see the same thing in Enoch. There's a couple of numbers. And the Dead Sea Scroll versions, the few that we have that have numbers in them, they match Genesis perfectly. So that's what's really cool about that. So again, that's that whole concept of take it everything with a grain of salt, but don't throw it away and not study it either. Second Thessalonians mentions that there was a forged letter in the name of Paul to Thessalonica. And we've seen this too, because we're also told in Colossians to read Paul's epistle to Laodicea, which is not in our New Testament canon. We said it's been preserved in a few other places, but or at least we think it is, because the Maturonian canon fragment we talked about a couple weeks ago, one of the early church fathers saying this is what should be in the New Testament and this is why. This is how it happened. This is the guy's name. This is where it was at. Gives us a lot of details. But he mentions that there is a forged version of Laodiceans and Alexandrians, forged in the name of Paul, specifically against the heresy of Marcion. And that helps us. So if you find a Laodiceans, for instance, you can, if you know what Marcion taught, what that particular cult taught, you can look at it and it's either trying to combat those ideas or it's not. So it's something to look at. Either way, there at least was a real one and at least one fake one, for sure. And then with Corinthians, again, we have 3rd Corinthians from the Armenian canon we talked about. And the church fathers talk about 4 separate epistles to Corinth, 2 of which are canonized and 2 are not. And you can see this in the books, because in 1 Corinthians, we have a guy who was fornicating and he refused to repent. So Paul said, kick him out of the church, excommunicate him. Well, apparently they did that, because then in 2 Corinthians, the guy repented and they reinstated him like they should. Well, you have to sin to get kicked out, and then you have to get kicked out to be reinstated. So that tells us that 2 Corinthians is after 1 Corinthians for sure. Well, in 1 Corinthians 5, on that same issue about what to do with this guy, Paul says, I wrote to you earlier in an epistle not to accompany with fornicators. So kick this guy out of your church. Well, that tells us that there's an epistle of Paul to Corinth written before 1 Corinthians. And in 3 Corinthians, with the Armenian version, it doesn't have anything to do with anything about fornication. So that's not the one Paul's talking about. So in order, there should be a 0, a 1, a 2, and the 3rd one. And so to my knowledge, I don't know anything about the 0 Corinthians, but we do have 3rd. So that's pretty interesting. You don't really learn a whole lot more, but there is some interesting insights about Gnosticism coming back in the end times, and that's already happened, so that's not a problem. And then a couple of names of people that were the Gnostic problems in Corinth. And, that means really nothing to us, but it is kind of interesting to see. And then in Hebrews, Paul mentions, and again, not by name, but he mentions the martyrdom of Isaiah. He talks about some people were put in logs and sawed in two. That's in many historical documents about how Isaiah died. So that's the death of the prophet Isaiah. And there's a lot of other things when we get to them. For instance, I was talking with a friend earlier today and saying that in Matthew chapter 11, the disciples of John the Baptist come to Jesus and say, are you he who was to come, or should we look for another? And a lot of times we look at that and say, John the Baptist was doubting after all this time. No, he wasn't doubting. The Essene theology said two comings of one Messiah. The Pharisees are saying, no, there's 2 separate guys. And Jesus seemed to be doing some things, but he definitely wasn't ushering in a kingdom and killing all the Romans or anything like that. So the question, and I would be the same way. I would walk up to Jesus and say, just between you and me, pre-trib rapture, right? Yeah, okay. Can you lose your salvation? The gifts still do function, right? Okay, just checking. That's what I would be doing too, even though I'm absolutely sure in my heart, I would like to go ask just to make sure. And I'm sure that's what he was doing. But the interesting thing about that story is that Jesus says, go tell him that the blind receive their sight, that the poor have the gospel preached to him, that the dead are raised. He mentions, I think, 5 things. And what's interesting is we've always thought that these 5 are like things scattered through the Old Testament, and 4 of them are mentioned in the Old Testament by different prophets in different places, except for the dead being raised. That's not a prophecy about what the Messiah would do in the Old Testament. But what's really interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is something called the Messianic Anthology, and it's just a list of prophecies that some guy had put together from whatever, saying the Messiah will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's the same set, including the raising the dead. So we understand from the church fathers that John the Baptist ran the school of the prophets and would have been very familiar with that. Just like if I would have a chance to talk to Gary Stearman and Chuck Missler and all these guys and say, pull all of your stuff together and let's make a list. And that becomes the list of the, Calvary Chapel or the Baptist or whatever. And so he's running the school, and Jesus says, go back and tell him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't have to say yes or no. Just tell him the 5 are fulfilled. Let him decide. And John the Baptist is going to say the 5 are fulfilled. Okay, that takes care of that scroll. So it's interesting to see that because there's all these different things in there. And at one point, Jesus quoted about something, I forget exactly the quote, but he quotes about Abraham doing something. And it doesn't say anything in the Old Testament about Abraham doing that, but Jesus was there. We just say, well, he was there, he knows. But the Pharisees stop and they say, how does he know this? He's not a man of letters. That's what it says in the King James. And basically what they're saying is there's the public canon, all the kids know it. And then there's the other stuff that only the scholars are allowed to study. He's not a Pharisee. He's never been part of our group. So how does he know about that one thing in that one book? And it turns out that's a quote from Jubilees, actually. And so, again, Jesus doesn't say, Enoch said, Jubilees said, Messianic Anthology said, the scrolls said. He just says, this is what happened. You decide. So there are direct quotes like the book of Enoch or Enoch prophesied. And then there's other loose quotes where a prophet or it is written, blah, blah, blah. And you don't know who wrote it. You have to go back and find out. And usually if it's in the Old Testament, you can find it. Then there's actually several more of those, but these are the official quotes where we mention something like Enoch or Samuel, Jasher, those kind of things. So this is a good start for us, and I think I had one duplicate in here at least. So these are 40, I think, some books mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament as things we would want to study. Again, being careful of. So next week, if we have time, we will go through the Dead Sea Scroll. Probably not endorsed. I might change that, but Dead Sea Scroll books, kind of doing the same thing. First off, what books are actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls? So we've got the 39 books of the Old Testament, which is actually 38 because we found pieces of every single book except for Esther. But I say 39 because we also found a piece of parchment that says there's supposed to be the 24 books, which is our 39. So if we found every one except one, and they're all fragmented anyway, and a list that says it's the same amount of books, then we know Esther was included. We just haven't found a piece of it yet. So we've got the Old Testament, and then we've got the other histories, the chronologies, the other prophecies and stuff from the school of the prophets. We're going to pull all that together when we can.